Boris Johnson sets out his Super Canada Brexit plan. Boris Johnson has set out his own plan for Brexit, arguing that the UK should chuck Chequers and negotiate a Super Canada free trade deal instead. The ex-Foreign Secretary, who quit over Theresa May's Chequers Brexit plan, called her strategy a moral and intellectual humiliation. He said his vision would not lead to a hard Irish border, with any checks carried out away from the crossing. The PM says her plan is the only one which will avoid carving up the UK. BBC political correspondent Jonathan Blake said there was little new in Mr Johnson's intervention, but the timing, on the eve of the Conservative Party conference, was significant as the Prime Minister would face further pressure from her own MPs to change her approach to Brexit. The UK is due to leave the EU on March 29, 2019. The two sides are seeking to negotiate the terms of exit, as well as an outlined agreement on future cooperation. Parliament is to vote on any withdrawal deal. In an article for The Telegraph titled "A Better Plan for Brexit," Mr Johnson wrote there had been a collective failure of government, and a collapse of will by the British establishment, to deliver on the mandate of the people. He said the Chequers proposals, which would keep the UK closely aligned with the EU in trade in goods, represented the intellectual error of believing we can be half in, half out of the EU. UK firms would be exposed to EU regulations that could disadvantage them, and free trade deals would be made more difficult. This, he said, was a democratic disaster and would cheat the electorate if implemented. He proposed a looser free trade agreement, at least as deep as the one the EU has recently concluded with Canada. Canada's deal with the EU, signed in 2016, removes the vast majority of customs duties on EU exports to Canada and Canadian exports to the EU. Mr Johnson said a Super Canada deal would involve. Mr Johnson argued that it should be relatively straightforward to negotiate membership of the EU's aviation area, with a process for recognizing each other's rules and a dispute mechanism in which neither side's institutions had power over the other. He also said cooperation between the UK and EU would be closer on areas such as security and defence. On the issue of Northern Ireland, he said any extra procedures could be carried out away from the border with Ireland. But Mr Johnson said the UK would have to buy some time to negotiate such a deal, pointing at the possible need to extend any transition period beyond 2020. Mrs May set out her proposals on the key issue of future trade with the EU after a Chequers summit in July. It has been fiercely criticised by some Brexiteers, who say her plans for a common rulebook on goods would compromise the UK's sovereignty. Up to 40 Tory Brexiteers have said they will oppose her plan if it comes to a vote in Parliament, and European leaders warned her last week that key parts of her strategy were not viable. Mrs May has dismissed previous suggestions that checks could be carried out away from the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, insisting that any system of checks was still a hard border. You don't solve the issue of no hard border by having a hard border 20 kilometres inside Ireland, she told the BBC last week.